The fluorescent lights of Pinnacle Solutions' 23rd floor cast harsh shadows across empty cubicles as I hunched over my laptop, the blue glow of spreadsheets and financial models painting my face in the artificial twilight of another late night at the office. Outside, Chicago's skyline glittered with the promise of nightlife and social connections I had long since abandoned in favor of the solitary pursuit of analytical perfection. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday, and I was alone, except for the night security guard and the persistent hum of servers processing data that most of my colleagues took for granted. This had become my routine over the past 18 months, staying long after the official workday ended, diving deeper into patterns and projections that others dismissed as unnecessarily detailed or obsessively thorough. My colleagues had names for my dedication, none of them complimentary. "Davidson's living at the office again," they would joke as they packed up promptly at 5 p.m. "Someone should tell him there's a world outside those spreadsheets." The mockery was gentle but persistent, painting my work ethic as evidence of social inadequacy rather than professional commitment. Sarah Mitchell, the marketing director whose designer suits and strategic networking had fast-tracked her to senior management, was particularly fond of commentary about my priorities. "Marcus, you need to get a life," she had declared just that afternoon as I declined another invitation to happy hour drinks. "The company won't collapse if you leave before midnight occasionally." The irony wasn't lost on me that Sarah's advice about work-life balance came from someone whose own success was built on strategic socializing and political positioning rather than substantive achievement. While she cultivated relationships at industry events and client dinners, I remained at my desk, searching for insights that others overlooked in their rush toward more visible and immediately rewarding activities. Tonight's focus was the quarterly financial projections for our largest client, Meridian Industrial, a manufacturing conglomerate whose contract represented nearly 30% of Pinnacle's annual revenue. The preliminary analysis that our senior partners had approved looked solid on the surface, but something in the underlying assumptions troubled me enough to warrant the deep dive that had kept me working through another evening while my colleagues enjoyed their personal lives. As I scrolled through historical data patterns and cross-referenced market indicators that others had deemed irrelevant to our analysis, a discrepancy began emerging that made my pulse quicken. The numbers weren't adding up the way they should, and the implications, if I was correct, could affect far more than just our client relationship with Meridian. At 12:15 a.m., I discovered something that would transform everything, a pattern hidden within the financial data that suggested our company was about to recommend a strategy that could cost Meridian $40 million through a catastrophic miscalculation that no one else had identified. The pattern I was discovering required hours of additional analysis to confirm, cross-referencing Meridian's internal data with external market indicators that our standard analytical framework typically ignored. While my colleagues had relied on conventional consulting methodologies focused on quarterly optimization, I had been tracking longer-term cycles that suggested Meridian was positioning themselves for disaster through timing that couldn't have been worse. The strategy our senior partners planned to recommend, divesting Meridian's Southeast Asian manufacturing facilities to raise capital for European expansion, was based on market projections that failed to account for emerging trade policy changes and currency fluctuations that would make those Asian facilities exponentially more valuable within 6 months. Our prestigious consulting team had apparently missed signals that would be obvious to anyone tracking international regulatory developments and geopolitical trends. "This can't be right," I muttered to myself, reviewing the calculations for the 4th time as dawn began lightening the windows around me. But the numbers were undeniable. Meridian would be selling assets worth approximately $100 million for $60 million in cash, based on Pinnacle's advice that presented this transaction as strategic brilliance rather than catastrophic timing. The consulting industry operated on reputation and results. A $40 million mistake would destroy Pinnacle's credibility with major clients while exposing the company to malpractice litigation that could force bankruptcy. More importantly, thousands of Meridian employees would lose their jobs when the manufacturing divestiture eliminated profitable operations that should have been expanded rather than sold. I spent Friday morning creating a comprehensive alternative analysis that demonstrated both the flaws in our recommended strategy and the superior approach that would maximize Meridian's position in changing market conditions. The presentation required expertise in international trade law, currency markets, and manufacturing logistics, knowledge I had accumulated through years of staying late to study subjects that others dismissed as outside our consulting scope. By Friday afternoon, I had prepared a presentation that essentially invalidated the strategy our senior partners had spent months developing while proposing alternative approaches that would save Meridian from financial disaster while positioning them for unprecedented growth. The question was whether anyone would listen to analysis that contradicted the conclusions of more senior and politically connected colleagues. "Working late again, Marcus," commented James Wellington, the senior partner who supervised our team, as he passed my cubicle at 6 p.m. while heading home to his weekend plans. "The Meridian presentation is locked and ready for Monday's client meeting. Time to let it go and enjoy your weekend." "Actually," I said, gathering courage that felt foreign after years of deferential compliance with senior authority, "I've identified some significant issues with our analysis that I think require immediate attention." James paused, his expression shifting from casual dismissal to irritated attention. "Issues? Marcus, the presentation has been reviewed by 3 senior partners and approved by the executive committee. What issues could possibly require weekend work?" I gestured toward my computer screen displaying the alternative analysis that had consumed my past 18 hours. "The currency projections we're using are based on assumptions that don't account for regulatory changes taking effect in December. If Meridian follows our recommendation, they'll be divesting assets just before those assets become significantly more valuable." James glanced at the screen with the superficial attention of someone whose weekend plans were being threatened by subordinate concerns. "Marcus, you're overthinking this. Currency fluctuations are factored into our models through standard risk assessment protocols. The executive committee has confidence in our analysis." The dismissal was polite but firm, reflecting the hierarchical assumption that senior partners' approval eliminated the need for continued questioning by junior staff. James began moving toward the elevator, clearly considering the conversation concluded. "James," I called, stopping him before he could escape. "The potential loss to Meridian could exceed $40 million. This isn't overthinking. It's identifying a critical error that could destroy both their company and our reputation." This specific quantification of potential damages caused James to pause, his business instincts recognizing that $40 million represented the kind of mistake that could trigger professional liability claims exceeding Pinnacle's insurance coverage. "Show me," he said reluctantly, returning to my workstation with visible resignation at having his weekend delayed by subordinate concerns that would probably prove irrelevant. The next 30 minutes transformed James from skeptical senior partner to increasingly concerned executive, as I walked him through the analysis that revealed fundamental flaws in our team's currency projections, market timing assumptions, and regulatory compliance frameworks. The elegant consulting presentation that had impressed our internal review process was based on data that had become obsolete weeks earlier. "Jesus Christ," James whispered, as the implications became clear. "If this analysis is correct, we're about to recommend that Meridian sell their most valuable assets at exactly the wrong time." "The timing couldn't be worse," I confirmed, showing him projections that demonstrated how regulatory changes would transform Southeast Asian manufacturing from liability to enormous strategic advantage. "The facilities we're recommending they sell will be worth triple their current valuation by next spring." James stared at my computer screen as if it contained nuclear launch codes rather than financial projections. The prestigious client presentation that was supposed to demonstrate Pinnacle's strategic brilliance would instead expose catastrophic analytical failures that could destroy both companies' reputations and financial stability. "We need to call an emergency meeting," he decided, reaching for his phone to begin the process of alerting senior leadership to a crisis they had unknowingly created through analytical overconfidence and insufficient attention to emerging market conditions. As James began making calls that would extend his disrupted weekend into a company-wide emergency response, I reflected on the irony that my obsessive late-night work, mocked by colleagues as evidence of social dysfunction, had uncovered analytical errors that could have cost our client $40 million while destroying Pinnacle's reputation and professional credibility. The mockery would likely continue, but its context had fundamentally changed. Working late wasn't social inadequacy, when it prevented catastrophic business failures that conventional work schedules and standard analytical frameworks had failed to identify. The emergency weekend meeting convened at 8 a.m. Saturday in Pinnacle's main conference room, with senior partners arriving in casual clothes that reflected the disruption to their personal plans, while their expressions conveyed the gravity of the crisis my analysis had revealed. CEO Elizabeth Pinnacle herself had cut short a family vacation in Martha's Vineyard to address what James had described as a potential company-ending mistake in our most important client engagement. "Marcus," she began without pleasantries, her usual diplomatic warmth replaced by the focused intensity she reserved for genuine crises. "James briefed me on your concerns about the Meridian analysis. Walk us through exactly what you've discovered." The presentation I delivered over the next hour was the most important of my career, methodically dismantling the analytical assumptions that had guided months of strategic development while proposing alternative approaches that would serve Meridian's actual interests rather than outdated market projections. Every senior partner in the room watched with growing alarm as I demonstrated how their prestigious consulting recommendations would have guided our client toward financial disaster. "The currency hedging strategies we've recommended," I explained, displaying comparative projections on the conference room's massive screen, "assume regulatory stability that ceased to exist when the Bangkok Accords were signed 3 weeks ago. Our analysis was locked before those developments were fully understood." Senior partner Margaret Foster, whose international expertise had been central to developing the original Meridian strategy, interrupted with sharp attention to details that challenged her professional reputation. "The Bangkok Accords affect trade relationships, not manufacturing facility valuations. Our analysis focused on operational efficiency rather than regulatory arbitrage." "With respect," I replied, displaying the regulatory framework that had emerged from those negotiations. "The Accords establish preferential trading status for manufacturing facilities that meet specific environmental and labor standards, standards that Meridian's Southeast Asian operations already exceed, but which our recommended divestiture would transfer to competitors." This revelation struck the room like a physical blow. Not only would Meridian lose valuable assets through our recommended sale, but those assets would become significantly more valuable in the hands of competitors who would use Meridian's own facilities to capture market share that regulatory changes were about to make available. "How did we miss this?" Elizabeth asked, her tone reflecting genuine bewilderment that Pinnacle's analytical process had failed so catastrophically on such a high-profile engagement. "The Bangkok Accords were negotiated through diplomatic channels rather than standard trade policy mechanisms," I explained, consulting the international legal documents I had been tracking through sources that conventional consulting typically ignored. The implications for manufacturing facility valuation weren't immediately apparent unless you were specifically monitoring Southeast Asian regulatory developments. This distinction highlighted a fundamental problem with Pinnacle's analytical approach: reliance on standard economic indicators while overlooking political and regulatory factors that increasingly determined business value in globalized markets. My late-night research habits had led me to sources and perspectives that the firm's traditional methodologies systematically excluded. "What's your recommended alternative strategy?" Elizabeth asked, her question confirming that she was prepared to completely abandon months of senior partner work in favor of analysis developed by a mid-level employee whose expertise had been consistently undervalued. I outlined the comprehensive strategic framework I had developed as an alternative to the disastrous divestiture, maintaining the Southeast Asian facilities while restructuring European operations through partnerships rather than acquisitions, positioning Meridian to benefit from regulatory changes while avoiding the capital requirements that had motivated the original asset sale recommendation. This approach preserves Meridian's competitive advantages while achieving the expansion objectives that motivated our original analysis, I concluded. The financial projections show superior returns with significantly reduced risk compared to the divestiture strategy. The alternative analysis was so clearly superior to our original recommendations that the room fell into uncomfortable silence as senior partners absorbed the magnitude of the error they had collectively committed. Their reputation for strategic brilliance had been preserved only by my willingness to work late enough to identify market developments they had completely missed. "Implementation timeline?" Elizabeth inquired, her practical focus on execution reflecting acceptance of my alternative analysis despite its complete contradiction of the firm's previous conclusions. "The presentation can be modified and ready for Monday's client meeting," I replied, though the revision would require another weekend of intensive work to properly integrate new analytical frameworks with existing client relationship management. However, Meridian's leadership should be briefed on the regulatory developments immediately, before they make any irreversible commitments based on our previous recommendations. This suggestion, direct client communication to prevent financial disaster, represented a significant departure from Pinnacle's normal procedures, where client contact was carefully managed through established hierarchies that emphasized partner relationships over technical expertise. "Make the call," Elizabeth decided without hesitation. "Marcus, you'll present the revised analysis directly to Meridian's board on Monday. This is your project now." The promotion from junior analyst to lead consultant on our most important engagement was both vindication and overwhelming responsibility. Success would establish my reputation as a strategic thinker, capable of challenging conventional wisdom when necessary. Failure would confirm every criticism about analytical overthinking and social dysfunction that had characterized colleagues' assessment of my late-night work habits. Monday morning's presentation to Meridian Industrial's board of directors would determine not just the success of my career-defining analysis, but potentially the survival of both companies involved. I arrived at Meridian's Chicago headquarters at 7 a.m., 2 hours before the scheduled meeting, carrying presentation materials that represented the most comprehensive strategic analysis I had ever developed. The Meridian boardroom occupied the entire top floor of their downtown tower, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Lake Michigan, while the interior featured the kind of understated luxury that communicated serious wealth without ostentation. CEO Marcus Blackstone and his senior executive team were already assembled when Elizabeth Pinnacle and I arrived, their expressions reflecting curiosity about why their consulting presentation had been completely restructured over a single weekend. "Thank you for accommodating this revised presentation on short notice," Elizabeth began, her diplomatic skills managing the awkwardness of essentially repudiating months of previous consulting work. "Our team has identified developments that significantly affect the strategic recommendations we were prepared to present." Marcus Blackstone studied me with the sharp attention of someone whose success had been built on accurately assessing people and situations. At 58, he had transformed Meridian from a regional manufacturer into a global industrial leader through strategic thinking and operational excellence that had earned respect throughout the business community. "Mr. Davidson," he addressed me directly, "Elizabeth mentioned that you've identified problems with the Southeast Asian divestiture strategy. I'm curious about your analysis, given that 3 senior partners have spent months developing recommendations that seemed quite compelling." The directness of his approach, bypassing Elizabeth to engage with me as the source of the analytical revision, reflected his reputation for cutting through corporate hierarchy to access information and expertise, regardless of organizational politics. "Mr. Blackstone," I began, my presentation materials arranged with careful precision. "The divestiture strategy was based on market conditions and regulatory frameworks that have fundamentally changed over the past month through developments that conventional consulting analysis typically wouldn't monitor closely. I outlined the Bangkok Accords and their implications for Southeast Asian manufacturing, demonstrating how regulatory changes would transform Meridian's facilities from cost centers requiring divestiture into strategic assets that would generate unprecedented competitive advantages. The analysis required expertise in international trade law, environmental compliance, and currency markets, knowledge areas that existed at the intersection of multiple disciplines rather than within any single professional specialty. The financial projections show the difference clearly, I continued, displaying comparative models that illustrated the vast gap between outcomes under the original divestiture plan versus the strategic retention approach I was recommending. Selling now would cost approximately $40 million in lost value, while restructuring for regulatory compliance would generate similar returns through enhanced competitive positioning. CFO Patricia Chen leaned forward, her attention focused on the financial documentation that supported my revised strategy. "These regulatory changes, How confident are you in their implementation timeline and actual impact on facility valuation? The Bangkok Accords have been ratified by all participating governments, I replied, consulting the legal documentation I had compiled through sources that conventional business intelligence typically overlooked. Implementation begins January 1st, with preferential trading status taking effect immediately for qualifying facilities. This specificity, providing exact dates and legal citations rather than vague projections, demonstrated the depth of research that had enabled me to identify opportunities and risks that Pinnacle's traditional analytical approach had missed entirely. "What's the competitive landscape if we maintain these facilities?" Marcus asked, his strategic thinking immediately focusing on how Meridian's position relative to other manufacturers would be affected by the regulatory changes. Meridian would become the only American manufacturer with compliant facilities positioned to access preferential trading status, I explained, displaying market analysis that showed how regulatory changes would create temporary monopoly advantages for companies with proper facility positioning. Your competitors would need 18 months minimum to establish comparable operations. This competitive advantage, derived from regulatory foresight rather than operational superiority, represented exactly the kind of strategic opportunity that had built Meridian's success over decades of international business development. As questioning continued through the morning, with board members exploring implications and implementation challenges of my alternative strategy, I found myself operating at a level of professional engagement I had never experienced. Rather than providing technical support for senior partners' strategic thinking, I was functioning as the primary strategist whose analysis would guide decisions affecting thousands of jobs and hundreds of millions in corporate value. "The revision makes sense from every analytical perspective," Marcus concluded after reviewing both the original divestiture recommendation and my alternative approach. "Marcus, your analysis has identified opportunities our previous consultants completely missed while preventing what would have been a catastrophic strategic error." The praise was gratifying, but more significant was the implicit criticism of Pinnacle's senior partners, whose months of work had been revealed as fundamentally flawed through my weekend of intensive analysis. The mockery I had endured for working late had been transformed into the key differentiator that prevented corporate disaster through analytical thoroughness that conventional consulting schedules couldn't accommodate. "We'll be implementing your recommendations immediately," Marcus announced, his decision confirming that my late-night work had not only saved Meridian from financial disaster, but had established my credibility as a strategic thinker capable of challenging conventional wisdom when circumstances required it. The immediate aftermath of my successful Meridian presentation created a seismic shift in Pinnacle Solutions' internal dynamics that extended far beyond simple recognition of analytical capability. Within 24 hours of my board presentation, word had spread throughout the consulting industry that a mid-level analyst had identified and prevented a $40 million strategic error that senior partners had missed, a story that enhanced my professional reputation, while raising uncomfortable questions about Pinnacle's quality control and analytical rigor. Elizabeth Pinnacle called me into her office Tuesday morning, her expression combining relief at avoiding catastrophic client loss with concern about the internal implications of such a dramatic analytical failure by senior staff. "Marcus, your work on the Meridian revision has been exceptional, but it's also exposed some significant gaps in our standard consulting processes." The diplomatic phrasing couldn't disguise the reality that my weekend analysis had revealed systematic problems with how Pinnacle approached complex strategic consulting, problems that could affect multiple client relationships if similar analytical blind spots existed in other high-profile engagements. "I've been asked by our executive committee to conduct a comprehensive review of active client strategies," she continued, outlining an assignment that would essentially position me to audit the work of senior partners whose experience and credentials far exceeded my own. "Your international market expertise and analytical methodology will be applied across our entire client portfolio." This unprecedented authority, granted to someone who had been mocked for obsessive late-night work just days earlier, represented recognition that analytical competence mattered more than hierarchical positioning when client interests and company reputation were at stake. The promotion came with its own office, a substantial salary increase, and most significantly, direct reporting relationship to Elizabeth, rather than filtering through the senior partner structure that had consistently undervalued my contributions. More importantly, it provided platform for implementing analytical standards that would prevent future strategic errors through the kind of comprehensive research that conventional consulting timelines typically couldn't accommodate. "There's something else," Elizabeth added, as our meeting concluded. "Meridian's Marcus Blackstone specifically requested your assignment as lead consultant for their long-term strategic planning initiatives. He was unimpressed with our previous team's failure to identify such obvious market developments. This client-driven demand for my services represented the ultimate vindication, not just internal company recognition, but external validation from the sophisticated business leader whose 40 million I had saved through analytical persistence that others had dismissed as excessive dedication. The next 6 months were transformative for both my career and Pinnacle's reputation within the consulting industry. The comprehensive client portfolio review I conducted revealed analytical deficiencies across multiple engagements, though none as catastrophic as the Meridian near disaster. My recommendations for enhanced research protocols and international market monitoring were implemented company-wide, establishing new standards that positioned Pinnacle as the most thorough and reliable strategic consulting firm in our market sector. Most significantly, the Meridian success had generated referrals from other manufacturing and technology companies seeking strategic analysis that incorporated the kind of regulatory foresight and international perspective that had prevented the Southeast Asian divestiture disaster. My expertise in identifying patterns that others overlooked had become Pinnacle's primary competitive advantage, transforming late-night analytical obsession into the firm's most valuable service offering. "The industry recognition has been remarkable," reported Marketing Director Sarah Mitchell during one of our monthly strategic planning meetings, her tone now carrying respect rather than the condescending concern she had previously expressed about my work-life balance. 3 business publications have featured Marcus's analytical approach as representing the next evolution in strategic consulting. The same person who had advised me to get a life was now promoting my analytical methodology as evidence of Pinnacle's innovative thinking and competitive superiority. Her marketing materials emphasized my willingness to work beyond conventional schedules as dedication to client success rather than social dysfunction, a narrative transformation that reflected how dramatically success could recontextualize behavior that had previously been criticized. "Speaking of recognition," Elizabeth added with satisfaction that reflected both personal and corporate pride, "Marcus has been invited to deliver the keynote address at the International Strategic Consulting Conference next month. His presentation on preventing analytical failures through comprehensive research methodology will be attended by senior consultants from every major firm in North America and Europe. This invitation to address the industry's most prestigious professional gathering represented achievement beyond anything I had imagined possible when working those solitary late nights that had revealed the patterns others missed. The mockery that had characterized colleagues' response to my analytical persistence had been transformed into industry-wide recognition of expertise that could prevent the kind of strategic disasters that destroyed both consulting firms and their clients. The International Strategic Consulting Conference in Geneva provided the perfect venue for presenting the analytical methodology that had saved Meridian from disaster while transforming my career from overlooked analyst to industry thought leader. The main auditorium was packed with senior partners from consulting firms whose collective client relationships represented hundreds of billions in managed assets. Professionals whose own analytical approaches would be influenced by the presentation I was about to deliver. The Meridian case demonstrates that conventional consulting timelines often conflict with the comprehensive analysis required to identify emerging risks and opportunities, I explained to the attentive audience, my presentation combining specific details of the Southeast Asian regulatory analysis with broader principles of strategic forecasting that could be applied across industries and markets. The response was immediate and engaged. Questions about methodology, requests for additional case studies, and networking conversations that established professional relationships with consultants whose expertise complemented my own analytical specializations. Most gratifying was recognition from industry leaders that my approach represented genuine innovation, rather than merely obsessive attention to detail. Your willingness to challenge senior partner conclusions based on independent analysis takes considerable professional courage, observed Dr. Heinrich Müller, whose Vienna-based firm specialized in European regulatory consulting. Most analysts would have accepted the conventional wisdom rather than risking career consequences through contradicting established authority. This acknowledgement of the professional risk I had taken, challenging senior partners whose approval determined my advancement prospects, reflected understanding of consulting industry dynamics, where hierarchical deference often took precedence over analytical accuracy. The most significant outcome of the conference wasn't professional recognition, but business opportunities generated through direct client interest in my analytical services. Several European manufacturing companies approached me about strategic engagements that would require exactly the kind of international regulatory expertise that had identified the flaws in Pinnacle's Meridian analysis. We've been struggling with similar regulatory complexity in our Eastern European operations, explained Catherine Dubois, CEO of a French industrial conglomerate, whose expansion challenges aligned perfectly with my emerging specialization. Traditional consulting approaches seem inadequate for the kind of multi-jurisdictional analysis required for effective strategic planning. These direct client approaches created an unexpected decision point: whether to remain at Pinnacle as an employee whose analytical methods were being implemented company-wide, or to establish independent consulting practice that would provide greater autonomy and potentially unlimited income growth through client relationships I was developing personally. The choice was complicated by loyalty to Elizabeth Pinnacle, whose support had enabled my transition from mocked late-night worker to recognized industry expert. Her investment in my professional development had been substantial and genuine, creating obligations that extended beyond mere employment contracts to encompass gratitude for opportunities that might never have emerged under different leadership. "Elizabeth," I said during our private conversation following the Geneva conference, "I've received several offers for independent consulting arrangements that would require leaving Pinnacle. I wanted to discuss this situation directly rather than creating uncertainty about my intentions." Her response reflected both understanding of my career advancement opportunities and strategic thinking about how to manage the potential loss of Pinnacle's most recognizable analytical expert. "Marcus, your success reflects well on Pinnacle, but it also creates value that extends beyond any single firm's ability to contain or fully utilize." What she proposed transformed my dilemma from binary choice between employment and independence into a collaborative arrangement that would benefit both my career development and Pinnacle's competitive positioning. Rather than losing my expertise through departure, Pinnacle would sponsor my independent consulting practice while maintaining exclusive access to my analytical methodology and international market intelligence. "You would operate as Pinnacle's chief strategic analyst while maintaining independence to pursue external consulting opportunities," she outlined, "with revenue sharing that reflects both your individual value and Pinnacle's platform support." The arrangement was unprecedented in our industry, but reflected Elizabeth's recognition that exceptional talent required exceptional accommodation rather than forcing artificial choices between loyalty and opportunity. My analytical methods would remain associated with Pinnacle's brand, while my expertise would be available to clients seeking strategic insight that transcended traditional consulting limitations. Additionally, Elizabeth continued, this structure would position Pinnacle as the industry leader in supporting analytical innovation, rather than simply employing it. Other firms would seek similar partnerships with specialized experts, creating a business model that could be replicated across different consulting specializations. The vision she outlined transformed my career advancement into a potential revolution in how consulting expertise was organized and deployed, shifting from hierarchical employment toward collaborative partnerships that recognized exceptional capability while maintaining institutional support and credibility. As we finalized arrangements for this innovative professional structure, I reflected on the remarkable journey from late-night analytical obsession to industry leadership that had been catalyzed by colleagues' mockery and nearly derailed by senior partners' analytical failures. The weekend that had begun with criticism of my work habits had evolved into complete transformation of both my professional prospects and Pinnacle's strategic positioning within the competitive consulting marketplace. 6 months after the Geneva conference had established my reputation as a strategic forecasting expert, I found myself managing a client portfolio that spanned 3 continents and generated revenue that exceeded what entire consulting teams typically produced. The independent practice Elizabeth had sponsored was operating from a sleek office overlooking Lake Michigan, equipped with the kind of analytical resources and international intelligence networks that enabled the comprehensive research approach that had become my signature methodology. "The Singapore expansion analysis is complete," reported Jennifer Chen, the former Pinnacle associate who had joined my practice specifically to develop expertise in Asian regulatory environments. "The manufacturing facility acquisition you recommended will position Morrison Industries advantageously for the trade preference programs launching next quarter. This success, another client saved from strategic miscalculation through analytical foresight that conventional consulting had missed, was becoming a recognizable pattern that attracted companies seeking strategic advice that incorporated political and regulatory intelligence alongside traditional financial analysis." The office intercom interrupted our review session. "Mr. Davidson," my assistant announced, "Marcus Blackstone is calling from Meridian Industrial. He says it's urgent." This unexpected contact from the client whose $40 million I had saved months earlier suggested either new strategic challenges requiring my analytical expertise or potentially concerning developments affecting the implementation of my recommended strategy. "Marcus," Blackstone's voice carried across the speaker with barely contained excitement, "I wanted to give you immediate notice that the Southeast Asian facilities you saved have just been designated as preferred partners for the new Pacific Trade Initiative. The regulatory advantages you identified are generating results ahead of even your optimistic projections." The news was better than my most ambitious forecasts. The Bangkok Accords had evolved into broader trade agreements that multiplied the competitive advantages available to manufacturers with properly positioned facilities. Meridian's Southeast Asian operations were now generating profits that exceeded their total operational costs, transforming potential liability into extraordinary asset value. "The financial impact?" I asked, though Blackstone's excitement suggested the numbers would be substantial. "Conservative projections show additional earnings of $60 million annually through preferential trading status," he replied, his voice reflecting amazement at returns that dwarfed the original facility values by enormous margins. "The facilities we almost sold for $60 million are now generating that much in annual profits above previous performance." This outcome exceeded my analytical projections by nearly 50%, demonstrating that even comprehensive international research couldn't fully predict the exponential effects of properly timed strategic positioning. The late-night work that had identified regulatory opportunities had generated results that would influence Meridian's competitive position for decades. "There's more," Blackstone continued. "The European manufacturers who were interested in acquiring our facilities are now requesting consulting services to develop similar regulatory compliance strategies. We're positioned to generate revenue through the very expertise that convinced us to retain rather than sell our Asian operations." This development transformed Meridian from potential seller of valuable assets to consultant helping competitors develop strategies to achieve similar advantages, a complete reversal that would generate additional revenue streams while maintaining superior competitive positioning. "Marcus, your analysis didn't just save us $40 million in lost asset value," Blackstone emphasized. "It positioned us to generate hundreds of millions in additional value through strategic advantages we never would have recognized without your international regulatory expertise." The quantification of impact, results measured not just in costs avoided, but in opportunities created, provided validation that extended beyond professional recognition to encompass genuine contribution to business success that would influence thousands of employees and millions in shareholder value. "I'm calling to discuss expanding our consulting relationship," Blackstone continued, his tone becoming more business-focused as he moved toward the purpose of his contact. "Meridian wants to retain your services exclusively for strategic planning and international market analysis. We're prepared to offer a 5-year consulting agreement that would make this your primary client engagement." The offer represented financial security and professional recognition beyond anything possible through traditional employment, while also ensuring that the analytical methods I had developed would continue to be applied to increasingly complex strategic challenges as Meridian expanded their global operations. The contract terms would include equity participation in projects that generate measurable value above baseline projections, Blackstone added, along with complete autonomy in developing analytical approaches and timeline management. This equity component meant that successful strategic recommendations would generate long-term wealth rather than merely consulting fees, a structure that aligned my interests with Meridian's success while providing incentives for the kind of thorough analysis that had characterized my approach from the beginning. As our conversation concluded with arrangements for contract negotiations and transition planning, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred since colleagues had mocked my late-night dedication as evidence of social dysfunction and analytical obsession. The same work habits that had been criticized as excessive had become the foundation for professional success that exceeded anything achievable through conventional career advancement within traditional consulting hierarchies. The 5-year exclusive consulting contract with Meridian Industrial was signed on a crisp October morning in Marcus Blackstone's executive office, with attorneys from both sides witnessing an agreement that represented the culmination of my transition from overlooked analyst to strategic advisor for one of America's most successful manufacturing companies. The financial terms were extraordinary. Guaranteed annual compensation that exceeded what senior partners at major consulting firms typically earned, plus equity participation that could generate substantial wealth if my strategic recommendations continued producing the kind of results achieved through the Southeast Asian facility analysis. This partnership represents more than a consulting arrangement, Marcus explained as we completed the signing ceremony, his tone reflecting both business satisfaction and personal respect that had developed through months of successful collaboration. You've demonstrated an analytical approach that identifies opportunities and risks others consistently miss. That capability becomes increasingly valuable as international business grows more complex. The expanded scope of my responsibilities would include not just reactive analysis of specific strategic questions, but proactive monitoring of global regulatory, political, and economic developments that could affect Meridian's operations across 23 countries. This comprehensive oversight would require the kind of international intelligence gathering and analytical synthesis that had originally been dismissed as excessive dedication, but was now recognized as essential competitive advantage. Your first major assignment, Marcus continued, removing a confidential folder from his desk safe, involves analysis of potential acquisition opportunities in the renewable energy sector. We're considering strategic entry into solar panel manufacturing, but the regulatory landscape is shifting so rapidly that conventional due diligence appears inadequate. The renewable energy analysis would require expertise in environmental law, international trade policy, and emerging technology markets, exactly the kind of multidisciplinary challenge that had motivated my late-night research habits and that traditional consulting typically addressed through committee approaches that often missed crucial interdisciplinary connections. Timeline? I asked, thinking of the comprehensive research that would be necessary to provide strategic recommendations worthy of the trust and financial commitment Marcus was demonstrating. 6 months for preliminary assessment, with ongoing analysis as regulatory and market conditions evolve, he replied. This isn't a one-time consulting project, but the beginning of long-term strategic partnership that will guide Meridian's evolution into industries we've never operated in before. This expansion of scope beyond Meridian's traditional manufacturing operations represented both extraordinary opportunity and substantial responsibility. My analytical methods would now influence corporate development decisions that could determine the company's competitive position for decades. As our meeting concluded, and I prepared to return to my office to begin the renewable energy analysis, Marcus made one final observation that captured the extraordinary transformation of my professional circumstances. 6 months ago, your colleagues were mocking your dedication to detailed analysis, he noted with amusement that reflected his own journey from skeptical client to enthusiastic partner. Now that same analytical approach is guiding strategic decisions for a company worth over $3 billion. Perspective has a way of changing when results speak louder than social conventions. The comment highlighted something I had been reflecting on throughout this remarkable period. That professional mockery often reflected more about the mocker's limitations than about the value of the work being mocked. My colleagues' criticism of late-night research had revealed their own comfort with analytical superficiality rather than identifying actual problems with comprehensive investigation. The renewable energy sector analysis will require even more intensive research than the Southeast Asian Regulatory Review, I acknowledged. Environmental compliance, technology development, and international policy are converging in ways that demand expertise across multiple domains, which is precisely why we're paying you to develop that expertise rather than relying on conventional consulting that addresses each domain separately, Marcus replied with satisfaction. Your ability to synthesize insights across different knowledge areas has proven more valuable than specialized expertise in any single domain. This recognition, that interdisciplinary analytical capability, was more valuable than narrow expertise, validated the research approach I had developed through years of staying late to study subjects that seemed peripheral to immediate consulting assignments, but which often provided crucial context for understanding complex strategic challenges. The consulting industry was beginning to recognize that global business complexity required analytical methods that transcended traditional professional boundaries. Exactly the kind of comprehensive research that had been dismissed as obsessive when practiced by a mid-level analyst, but was now eagerly sought by clients whose strategic challenges required innovative thinking rather than conventional wisdom. As I walked through Pinnacle's offices toward my own space, colleagues who had previously offered condescending advice about work-life balance now sought meetings to understand how my analytical methods might enhance their own client relationships. The transformation from office-eccentric to strategic innovator was complete, though the underlying analytical obsession that had driven both perceptions remained unchanged. The difference was that results had finally provided context that revealed obsessive attention to detail as professional excellence rather than social dysfunction, comprehensive research as competitive advantage rather than analytical excess, and late-night dedication as strategic investment rather than inability to maintain appropriate boundaries between work and personal life. 18 months into my exclusive partnership with Meridian Industrial, the renewable energy analysis had evolved into a comprehensive strategic framework that positioned the company for leadership in what was becoming the fastest-growing sector of the global economy. The solar panel manufacturing recommendations I had developed weren't merely about entering a new market, but about transforming Meridian's entire operational philosophy towards sustainability and environmental responsibility. The European facility acquisitions are proceeding ahead of schedule, reported Dr. Lisa Wang, the environmental technology expert I had recruited specifically for her expertise in solar panel manufacturing processes and regulatory compliance. The German plant will be operational 6 months earlier than projected, positioning us perfectly for the EU's accelerated renewable energy mandates. This success, another example of strategic timing that conventional consulting had missed, but which my comprehensive regulatory analysis had identified, was generating financial returns that validated Marcus Blackstone's investment in analytical approaches that extended far beyond traditional business intelligence. The most satisfying development was the complete vindication of my research methodology through measurable business outcomes. The late-night analysis that had once been mocked as excessive dedication was now being studied by consulting firms throughout the industry, seeking to replicate results that had transformed both Meridian's strategic position and my own professional trajectory. Harvard Business School is requesting permission to develop a case study about your analytical approach, informed my assistant Sarah Phillips, whose own career had been enhanced through association with the strategic successes that had made my practice a recognizable brand within the consulting industry. They want to examine how comprehensive research methods can identify opportunities that standard consulting frameworks consistently miss. The academic recognition represented another dimension of professional validation, my methodology being incorporated into MBA curricula that would influence how future business leaders approached complex strategic analysis. The techniques developed through years of solitary late-night research were becoming standard practices taught at the most prestigious business schools. "There's something else," Sarah continued, her expression suggesting information that was both significant and potentially concerning. Pinnacle Solutions has requested a meeting about licensing your analytical methodology for their global consulting operations. Elizabeth Pinnacle wants to discuss terms for formal partnership that would expand your approach across their entire client portfolio. This development was both flattering and strategically complex. My former employer seeking to systematize and scale the analytical methods that had originally been dismissed as individual obsession rather than transferable expertise. The irony of Pinnacle wanting to license approaches they had previously undervalued reflected how dramatically success could alter institutional assessment of unconventional methods. "What kind of partnership structure are they proposing?" I asked, curious about how Elizabeth was conceptualizing the integration of my research methodology with Pinnacle's established consulting practices. "Comprehensive licensing agreement with revenue sharing, plus faculty position at their new Strategic Analysis Institute," Sarah replied, consulting the preliminary terms that had been submitted through our legal representatives. "They want to build an entire consulting division around your international regulatory forecasting approach." The proposal represented recognition that my analytical methodology had commercial value extending far beyond my individual client relationships to encompass a reproducible approach that could enhance consulting capabilities across multiple firms and market sectors. My late-night research habits had inadvertently developed intellectual property that was now being sought by organizations seeking competitive advantage through superior analytical rigor. "The financial terms?" I inquired. Though success with Meridian had already provided security that made money less important than professional impact and intellectual legacy. 20% of revenue generated by projects using your methodology, plus substantial equity participation in the Strategic Analysis Institute," Sarah replied with satisfaction that reflected her own benefit from our practice's growing reputation and client base. "Along with complete autonomy in developing research approaches and selecting international associates for the expanded analytical network. This structure would transform my individual expertise into an institutional capability that could influence strategic consulting across the industry while maintaining the research independence that had enabled my analytical innovations in the first place. Rather than being absorbed into Pinnacle's existing hierarchy, I would be creating new institutional frameworks that reflected the value of comprehensive analysis over conventional consulting shortcuts. The meeting to discuss partnership terms was scheduled for the following week. Though the success of my independent practice had already provided negotiating leverage that would ensure any agreement reflected genuine partnership rather than employment relationship disguised as collaboration. As I prepared for these discussions, I reflected on the remarkable journey from late-night analytical obsession to industry transformation that had been catalyzed by colleagues' mockery and nearly derailed by senior partners' analytical failures. The persistence that had been criticized as social dysfunction had become the foundation for professional innovations that were reshaping how strategic consulting approached complex international challenges. The partnership negotiations with Pinnacle Solutions coincided with an unexpected development that would test both my analytical capabilities and my commitment to the ethical principles that had guided my career transformation. During routine monitoring of international regulatory changes for my expanding client base, I discovered evidence suggesting systematic manipulation of trade policy development by networks of consulting firms working in coordination with foreign governments. "The pattern is too consistent to be coincidental," I explained to Elizabeth Pinnacle during our partnership discussions, showing her the analysis that revealed coordinated influence campaigns targeting specific regulatory decisions. Multiple consulting firms are receiving payments from shell companies, ultimately controlled by foreign governments seeking to influence American trade policy through strategic misinformation. The discovery had emerged through the same comprehensive research methodology that had identified the Bangkok Accord's implications for Meridian's facilities, tracking regulatory developments across multiple jurisdictions while monitoring financial flows that conventional intelligence gathering typically overlooked. "Are you suggesting that consulting firms are being used as vehicles for foreign interference in American policy development?" Elizabeth asked, her expression reflecting both concern about national security implications and worry about potential damage to the consulting industry's reputation. "I'm documenting evidence that foreign governments have identified the consulting industry as an effective channel for influencing business strategy and indirectly affecting government policy through client relationships," I clarified, showing her specific examples of suspicious payment patterns and coordinated analytical recommendations that aligned with foreign strategic objectives rather than client interests. This revelation transformed my analytical work from commercial consulting into potential counterintelligence activity, identifying sophisticated influence operations that threatened both business interests and national security through exploitation of consulting relationships that had previously been considered secure from foreign manipulation. "What's the scope of this problem?" Elizabeth inquired, her strategic thinking immediately focusing on implications for Pinnacle's own operations and client relationships. "At least 12 major consulting firms appear to be affected," I replied, consulting the comprehensive analysis I had been developing over sleepless nights that now served national security purposes rather than merely commercial advantage. "The financial flows suggest coordination that extends beyond individual firm compromises to encompass systematic infiltration of the entire strategic consulting industry. The magnitude of what I was describing, foreign governments essentially purchasing influence over American business strategy through consulting firm manipulation, represented a threat to economic security that extended far beyond any individual company or client relationship. "We need to contact federal authorities immediately," Elizabeth decided, her tone reflecting recognition that this discovery required government attention regardless of potential disruption to business operations. This information could affect national economic policy and corporate security across multiple industries. The decision to involve federal investigators represented a significant risk to both my practice and Pinnacle's operations. Government attention would inevitably disrupt client relationships while exposing business practices to scrutiny that could reveal vulnerabilities or competitive disadvantages. Yet the alternative, allowing foreign manipulation of American business strategy to continue undetected, carried consequences that dwarfed commercial considerations. "I've already initiated contact with the FBI's Corporate Counterintelligence Division," I revealed, having recognized the security implications of my discoveries before scheduling this meeting with Elizabeth. "Agent Patricia Morrison is reviewing my analysis and will likely want to interview senior consultants from firms that appear to be compromised." This proactive approach, engaging law enforcement before the foreign influence operations could adapt to detection, reflected the same analytical thinking that had identified the Meridian opportunity through comprehensive research that anticipated developments rather than merely reacting to them. "Your late-night research habits have uncovered something that could affect national security," Elizabeth observed with a mixture of admiration and concern. "The same analytical persistence that saved Meridian $40 million has potentially identified threats worth billions to the American economy." The parallel was striking. Both discoveries had emerged through research that extended far beyond conventional consulting scope, identifying patterns that required synthesis of information from sources that traditional analytical frameworks systematically excluded. My reputation for obsessive attention to detail had become valuable precisely because global business complexity demanded obsessive attention to detail. "The FBI will want to use our consulting practice as a platform for counterintelligence operations," I explained, outlining the cooperation framework Agent Morrison had proposed. "Our international research network would provide cover for monitoring foreign influence attempts, while our client relationships would enable identification of strategic manipulation that might otherwise remain invisible." This evolution from commercial consulting to national security asset represented the ultimate transformation of my career, from mocked late-night worker to strategic analyst, whose expertise was now essential for protecting American business interests from sophisticated foreign interference. The partnership discussions with Elizabeth had suddenly expanded beyond revenue sharing and analytical methodology to encompass questions of patriotic duty and the responsibility that came with discovering threats that extended far beyond individual business considerations to encompass the integrity of American economic policy and corporate governance. "We proceed with full cooperation," Elizabeth decided, after absorbing the national security implications of my discoveries. "Your analytical methods have proven valuable for protecting both individual clients and broader economic interests. That capability should be supported and expanded rather than constrained by conventional business considerations. The FBI's counterintelligence operation, launched based on my discovery of foreign manipulation within the consulting industry, unfolded over the following 6 months with results that exceeded even Agent Morrison's expectations for exposing systematic threats to American economic security. My consulting practice became the central platform for an investigation that ultimately identified foreign influence operations affecting strategic business decisions across multiple industries and government policy areas. The Shanghai network has been completely mapped, Agent Morrison reported during one of our weekly briefings at the FBI's Chicago field office, where my analytical work had been integrated into a broader counterintelligence operation targeting foreign economic espionage. Your identification of payment patterns and coordinated analytical recommendations has enabled us to trace the entire influence structure from initial recruitment through policy manipulation. The investigation had revealed a sophisticated operation where foreign intelligence services had recruited American consulting firms through financial incentives that appeared to be legitimate business opportunities, but were actually designed to influence strategic recommendations that would ultimately benefit foreign economic and political interests at American expense. 12 consulting firms have been compromised to varying degrees, Agent Morrison continued, displaying a network diagram that showed the scope of foreign infiltration within an industry that advised the largest corporations and government agencies in America. Your methodology for tracking regulatory patterns and financial flows has become our primary tool for identifying consulting recommendations that serve foreign interests rather than client objectives. The revelation that my analytical obsession had uncovered a national security threat of this magnitude was both gratifying and sobering. The late-night research that colleagues had mocked as social dysfunction had identified foreign influence operations that threatened the integrity of American business strategy across multiple sectors of the economy. The most significant success has been preventing the Cascade Industries merger, Agent Morrison added, referring to a recent case where my analysis had identified that foreign-influenced consulting was guiding an American technology company toward acquisition by entities ultimately controlled by hostile governments. Your early warning allowed us to brief Cascade's leadership about the national security implications before irreversible commitments were made. This expansion of my analytical work into active counterintelligence operations represented evolution from commercial consulting to protecting American economic sovereignty, using the same research methods that had saved Meridian $40 million to identify and prevent foreign manipulation worth billions to national economic security. The consulting industry reforms that will emerge from this investigation, Agent Morrison continued, will establish mandatory disclosure requirements for foreign financial relationships and enhanced due diligence standards for international client recommendations. Your analytical approach will become the industry standard for detecting potential foreign influence. This systematic transformation of consulting practices, triggered by patterns I had identified through comprehensive research that others had dismissed as excessive, would protect American businesses from the kind of sophisticated manipulation that had been operating undetected for years. "There's one more development," Agent Morrison said, her expression becoming more serious. "We've identified the specific foreign operation that targeted you personally for recruitment after your Meridian success became known internationally." This revelation sent a chill through me. The analytical capabilities that had generated professional recognition had also attracted attention from the very foreign networks I had been helping to expose through my cooperation with federal investigators. The Shanghai Consulting Group made contact through intermediaries offering collaboration opportunities that would have provided access to your client relationships and analytical methodology, Agent Morrison explained, showing me documentation of the recruitment attempt that had been intercepted through surveillance of known foreign operatives.
Your refusal to engage with these offers confirmed their assessment that you weren't susceptible to the financial incentives they typically use for consultant recruitment. The attempted recruitment highlighted the value foreign governments placed on analytical capabilities that could identify regulatory opportunities and strategic vulnerabilities affecting American business interests.
My reputation for comprehensive research had made me a target for the same influence operations I was helping to investigate. Your analytical work has been more valuable to national security than most people in government service, Agent Morrison concluded. The consulting industry reforms, the prevented foreign acquisitions, and the exposed influence networks represent contributions that extend far beyond commercial success to encompass protection of American economic sovereignty. This assessment of impact, measured not just in dollars saved or businesses protected but in national security preserved, provided perspective on how dramatically my career had evolved from office eccentric to strategic asset whose work influenced policy at the highest levels of government. The Presidential Award for Excellence in Economic Security will be presented next month, Agent Morrison announced, revealing an honor I hadn't known existed, but which apparently recognized civilian contributions to protecting American economic interests from foreign threats. Your analytical methodology and dedication to comprehensive research have created capabilities that will protect American businesses and government agencies for years to come. As our briefing concluded, and I prepared to return to the consulting practice that had become a platform for both commercial success and national service, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had begun with colleagues mocking my late-night dedication and had evolved into recognition at the highest levels of government for analytical capabilities that protected American economic sovereignty. The same obsessive attention to detail that had been criticized as social dysfunction had become essential for identifying threats that more balanced work-life approaches would never have discovered. Sometimes, the most important work happened when everyone else had gone home, in the quiet hours when comprehensive analysis could identify patterns that crowded offices and busy schedules rendered invisible. The Presidential Award ceremony took place in the East Room of the White House, with an audience of government officials, business leaders, and security professionals who had been briefed on the counterintelligence operation that had emerged from my discovery of foreign influence within the consulting industry. Standing before the assembled dignitaries, receiving recognition from the President himself for analytical work that had protected American economic interests, I found myself thinking about the late nights and weekend research sessions that had seemed so unremarkable at the time, but had ultimately identified threats to national security. Marcus Davidson's analytical methodology, the President declared as he presented the award, demonstrates how individual dedication to excellence can generate results that protect not just specific businesses, but the integrity of American economic policy itself. His work represents the highest tradition of public service through private sector expertise. The citation was both personally meaningful and professionally transformative, establishing my reputation as an analyst whose expertise served national interests rather than merely commercial objectives. The recognition would inevitably influence how clients and colleagues understood the value of comprehensive research that extended beyond immediate business requirements to encompass broader economic and security considerations. Following the ceremony, I was approached by General Patricia Hayes, the director of the National Economic Security Council, whose responsibilities included coordinating government and private sector responses to foreign economic threats. "Mr. Davidson," she began, "your analytical capabilities have proven invaluable for identifying economic threats that traditional intelligence gathering often misses. We'd like to discuss establishing a formal advisory relationship that would provide your expertise to government agencies dealing with international economic security challenges." The proposal represented another evolution in my career trajectory, from commercial consultant to informal government advisor, to potentially formal consultant whose analytical methods would influence national policy regarding foreign economic threats and corporate security measures. "What would such an arrangement involve?" I asked, intrigued by the opportunity while concerned about maintaining the independence that had enabled my analytical innovations. "Monthly briefings on international regulatory developments and their implications for American business interests," General Hayes outlined, plus analysis of specific situations where foreign influence on American business strategy might be affecting economic or security policy. "Complete autonomy in research methods and conclusions, with regular retainer compensation that reflects the strategic value of your insights. This structure would preserve the analytical independence that had been essential for identifying foreign influence operations, while providing formal platform for applying my research methodology to protecting national economic interests." The arrangement represented recognition that effective counterintelligence required the kind of comprehensive analytical capabilities that had emerged from my unconventional research approach. "Additionally," General Hayes continued, "we're recommending your methodology for implementation across government agencies that monitor international economic activity. Your approach to synthesizing information from diverse sources has proven more effective than traditional intelligence analysis for identifying sophisticated influence operations." The prospect of my analytical methods being adopted by government agencies represented impact beyond anything I had imagined when staying late to research regulatory developments that others dismissed as peripheral to immediate consulting requirements. The techniques developed through individual obsession with comprehensive analysis would now protect American economic interests at the institutional level. As our conversation concluded with arrangements for formal advisory agreement negotiations, I was approached by Marcus Blackstone, who had attended the ceremony as my guest, despite the demands of managing Meridian's continued international expansion. "Marcus, your success has been extraordinary to witness," he said, his expression reflecting both business satisfaction and personal pride in the partnership that had transformed both our professional circumstances. From preventing our $40 million strategic error to becoming a presidential award recipient, it's been quite a journey. The journey he referenced had indeed been remarkable, though what struck me most was how little my fundamental approach had changed throughout this transformation. The late-night research, the comprehensive analysis, the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom when evidence suggested alternative conclusions. These characteristics had remained constant even as their professional context had evolved from individual obsession to national security asset. "The renewable energy expansion continues to exceed projections," Marcus continued, updating me on the strategic initiatives that had emerged from my analytical recommendations. "The European facilities are generating returns that validate your regulatory analysis while positioning Meridian for leadership in sustainability technologies that will define manufacturing for decades. This ongoing success, measured not just in immediate financial returns, but in strategic positioning for long-term competitive advantage, demonstrated that analytical persistence could generate value across multiple timeframes and market conditions. The comprehensive research that had once been mocked as excessive dedication was now recognized as essential for navigating business complexity that defeated conventional analytical approaches. Your late-night work habits have become legendary in business circles," Marcus observed with amusement, that reflected broader industry recognition of my unconventional path to professional success. "CEOs now joke about needing analysts who are willing to pull a Davidson when facing complex strategic challenges." The transformation of my work ethic from object of mockery to aspirational standard represented complete vindication of analytical approaches that had been dismissed as social dysfunction by colleagues who prioritized conventional boundaries between professional and personal time. The mockery had been replaced by recognition that extraordinary results often required extraordinary dedication that transcended normal work-life balance expectations. The crisis that would define the ultimate test of my analytical methodology arrived exactly 3 years after colleagues had mocked my late-night dedication, this time in the form of an emergency call from the National Economic Security Council at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. General Hayes' voice carried the urgency of someone dealing with threats that required immediate response despite the inconvenient timing. "Marcus, we have a developing situation that requires your immediate analytical assessment," she began without apologizing for the late hour. A recognition that national security emergencies didn't respect conventional business schedules. "Intelligence suggests a coordinated attack on American semiconductor manufacturing that's being facilitated through consulting recommendations to major technology companies." The attack she described was both sophisticated and devastating. Foreign operatives had infiltrated multiple consulting firms to provide strategic recommendations that would systematically weaken American semiconductor production while appearing to serve legitimate business optimization objectives. The operation represented exactly the kind of multi-layered influence campaign that my analytical methodology had been developed to detect and counter. "What's the timeline?" I asked, already moving toward my home office, where secure communication systems and comprehensive research databases would enable the kind of emergency analysis that conventional consulting frameworks couldn't provide on short notice. 18 hours, General Hayes replied grimly. "The major semiconductor companies are meeting tomorrow afternoon to coordinate strategic responses to what they believe are market pressures requiring immediate facility consolidations and supply chain restructuring. If those decisions proceed based on compromised consulting advice, American semiconductor production could be crippled for years." The timeline was impossibly tight for the kind of comprehensive analysis required to identify foreign influence operations while developing alternative strategic recommendations that would protect American technology leadership. Yet this was precisely the kind of emergency that had motivated my development of research methods capable of synthesizing complex information rapidly when circumstances demanded immediate action. "I'll need access to the consulting recommendations being presented to each company," I said, establishing requirements for the analytical work that would determine whether American semiconductor manufacturing survived intact or was systematically dismantled through strategic manipulation disguised as business optimization. "Already arranged," General Hayes confirmed. "FBI has obtained the presentations through national security letters. Additionally, we're providing real-time intelligence about foreign financial flows and communication intercepts that suggest coordination between the consulting recommendations and foreign strategic objectives. This level of government support, access to classified intelligence and law enforcement resources, represented recognition that my analytical capabilities had become essential for protecting American economic interests from sophisticated threats that conventional business intelligence and traditional counterintelligence methods were inadequate to address. The next 18 hours passed in a blur of comprehensive analysis that combined commercial consulting expertise with counterintelligence methodology to identify and counter the foreign influence operation targeting American semiconductor companies. Working with a small team of trusted associates and federal intelligence analysts, I dismantled the sophisticated recommendations that would have guided American companies toward strategic decisions that served foreign interests while appearing to optimize domestic business performance. "The pattern is unmistakable," I reported to the emergency session of semiconductor industry leaders that convened Wednesday evening at the Department of Commerce. My presentation revealing how coordinated consulting advice would have eliminated American competitive advantages while creating dependencies on foreign suppliers controlled by hostile governments. Every strategic recommendation follows the same template: immediate cost savings through facility consolidations that would ultimately transfer production capabilities to foreign competitors. The industry leaders, CEOs and senior executives whose companies collectively controlled over 60% of American semiconductor production, absorbed my analysis with growing alarm as they recognized how close they had come to implementing strategies that would have permanently damaged American technology leadership through decisions that seemed individually reasonable but collectively catastrophic. "Your analysis suggests we were minutes away from voting ourselves out of global competitiveness," observed Dr. Jennifer Walsh, CEO of Advanced Semiconductor Technologies, whose company's planned facility closures would have eliminated crucial production capabilities that foreign competitors were positioning to acquire through the strategic recommendations their agents had developed. As the meeting concluded with unanimous rejection of the foreign-influenced consulting advice and adoption of my alternative strategic framework, I reflected on the extraordinary validation of analytical methods that had evolved from personal obsession with late-night research to national security capability that protected American economic sovereignty from sophisticated foreign threats. The colleagues who had marked my dedication to working late had never imagined that those solitary hours of research would ultimately identify and prevent foreign operations designed to cripple American technology leadership through strategic manipulation of business consulting relationships. 5 years after my colleagues had mocked me for working late while they rushed home to their social lives, I stood in the newly constructed Davidson Center for Strategic Analysis at Georgetown University, addressing graduate students whose careers would be shaped by analytical methodologies that had emerged from those solitary nights of obsessive research. The center, endowed through a combination of government grants and private sector partnerships, represented the institutionalization of analytical approaches that had evolved from individual quirks into systematic capabilities for protecting American economic interests. The most dangerous assumption in strategic analysis, I explained to the attentive students, is that normal business hours provide sufficient time for comprehensive research into complex international challenges. The most critical patterns often emerge through patient synthesis of information that conventional analytical timelines cannot accommodate. This principle, that extraordinary analytical results required extraordinary analytical commitment, had become central to curriculum development at business schools and government training programs seeking to replicate the methodology that had identified threats worth billions to American economic security. The students listened with the focused attention of people who understood they were learning from someone whose unconventional approach had been validated through results that transcended academic theory to encompass real-world protection of national interests. Many would graduate into consulting positions where they would apply analytical methods that had originated in my late-night research sessions, but were now standard practices for identifying foreign influence and strategic manipulation. The semiconductor industry preservation that resulted from your work, observed Dr. Patricia Reynolds, the former FINRA examiner who now directed Georgetown's Economic Security Studies program, demonstrates how individual analytical excellence can influence policy at the highest levels of government while protecting employment and strategic capabilities that affect millions of Americans. The long-term impact had indeed been substantial, not just the immediate prevention of foreign manipulation, but the systematic improvements in how American businesses and government agencies approached strategic analysis involving international considerations. The analytical framework I had developed through years of comprehensive research was now being applied across government and private sector organizations to identify and counter sophisticated foreign influence operations. Your transformation from mocked late-night worker to presidential award recipient illustrates something important about the relationship between dedication and recognition, I continued, sharing insights that had emerged from reflection on my own career trajectory. Professional mockery often reveals more about the mocker's limitations than about the value of the work being criticized. This observation had become central to my approach to mentoring young analysts who displayed the kind of obsessive dedication to comprehensive research that had characterized my own development. The students who stayed late, who asked difficult questions, who pursued information sources that others dismissed as excessive. These were the analysts who would identify the next generation of threats and opportunities that conventional approaches would miss. The consulting practice has evolved beyond commercial success into something approaching public service, I concluded, referring to the work that now combines strategic business consulting with informal government advisory responsibilities that influenced policy affecting American economic security. When analytical excellence serves both individual client interests and broader national objectives, the distinction between private sector success and public service becomes meaningless. The audience's response, sustained applause from students and faculty who recognized the transformation of individual analytical obsession into institutional capability that protected American interests, validated the journey from office eccentric to strategic innovator whose work influenced both business policy and national security. After the lecture, I was approached by Jennifer Martinez, a doctoral student whose research focused on the intersection of business consulting and national security. Professor Davidson, your career demonstrates that sometimes the most important work happens when no one is watching, in the quiet hours when comprehensive analysis can identify patterns that crowded environments render invisible. Her observation captured something essential about the analytical approach that had defined my professional evolution, that breakthrough insights often required sustained focus and patient synthesis that conventional work environments discouraged through emphasis on collaboration, meetings, and immediate productivity over deep thinking and comprehensive research. The most complete vindication, I replied, thinking of the colleagues who had offered condescending advice about work-life balance, wasn't professional recognition or financial success, though both have been gratifying. The real satisfaction was seeing analytical persistence prevent genuine catastrophes. The 40 million Meridian would have lost, the semiconductor industry that would have been crippled, the foreign influence operations that would have continued manipulating American business strategy. As evening approached and students departed to begin their own analytical careers, I remained in the center that bore my name, surrounded by the resources and institutional support that would enable the next generation of analysts to develop their own obsessive dedication to comprehensive research. The late nights that had once seemed like evidence of social dysfunction were now recognized as the foundation for analytical excellence that served both commercial and national interests. The mockery had been transformed into methodology. The criticized dedication had become celebrated expertise, and the lonely late-night research had evolved into collaborative institutional capability that would protect American economic interests long after my individual contributions had passed into the historical record of successful counterintelligence operations. The company had indeed been saved from a $40 million loss, but more importantly, American economic sovereignty had been protected from foreign influence operations that would have cost billions while compromising the strategic independence that enabled continued prosperity and security. The late-night analyst had become the early warning system for threats that conventional wisdom was inadequate to detect or counter, threats that required exactly the kind of obsessive analytical dedication that had once been mocked, but was now essential for maintaining American competitive advantage in an increasingly complex global economy. If you enjoyed this story of dedication vindicated, analytical excellence triumphant, and the power of working when others rest, please subscribe to my channel for more tales that explore how extraordinary commitment leads to extraordinary results. In my next video, we'll uncover another compelling narrative where the overlooked individual possesses the key to solving everyone else's problems. Until then, remember that sometimes the most important work happens in the quiet hours when no one is watching, and the most valuable insights emerge from the patience to dig deeper than others are willing to go.